Now, it's indeed fitting, as we prepare to open the Bush Center, that we gather tonight to hear someone who is, of course, from that community. We gather, of course, to hear Amity Shlaes, best-selling author. In fact, from what I understand, within the last half hour, the book that we're going to discuss tonight has just hit the bestseller list, which I think is worthy of applause. She is, therefore, let me say, yet again, a best-selling author, a nationally syndicated columnist, and her book on Calvin Coolidge has verily sparked a national debate on government's true role within a marketplace and within a society, and in particular, its fiscal role. And her timing, therefore, could really not have been better. Echoes of today's debate over budgets, austerity, and even sequestration echo throughout her work. And it's no surprise, therefore, that publications such as the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, and the New York Times, to name but a few, have devoted considerable ink over the last several weeks to discussion of her work. This is an impressive span of media attention, to be sure, testament most of all to an author who has clearly touched an important nerve within our national debate. And tonight, of course, we have her all to ourselves. So, if you will please join me in welcoming to the podium our speaker for this evening, Amity Shlaes. In case you're wondering, I'm taller than she is. No offense.
Not that much. I didn't check what the market was doing, but it's been kind of up lately, stock market. And that's good. We have good news about our economy. We have a sense of energy. But we also have some bad news. We're a little concerned about employment, for example. Unemployment is still pretty high compared to history. We're worried, I think a lot of us worried about government spending. And when you look at the government spending debate, it's, it's how much should we spend? Should we spend it's a really broad choice the politicians tend to offer us, the choice between spend a whole lot and spend even more. Choice between yes and yes, basically. And that concerns some of us, and we're thinking about it, about the future, about the entitlements, about what happens to the economy after this happy moment for the stock market, for example. We sense this problem, we talk it over with our families, with ourselves, family's budget, company's budget. I've been working a little with American Express. They had to lay off 5,400 people recently. A government can be like a family or a company. It might need to budget, not just reduce its increases. When the government talks and says we're cutting, they usually mean cut their increases, not a true cut, but actually cut. A government that might conceivably say no. And we all have two questions. One is, should a government say no to spending, cut back? Set that one aside. And the second one is, can it, right? Does it even have that capacity? So setting aside should or not should, let's just focus on whether it can. And we do doubt whether the politicians are willing to say no or say anything but yes. Making government smaller seems impossible, especially when we're in peacetime and things seem kind of good in some areas. And we know that politicians fear they won't be elected again if they say no. So really what this lecture is a lecture about saying no, and the thesis is it's possible. We've had presidents who cut the budget in peacetime when there was economic growth, and one of those wasn't Ronald Reagan. But one was our subject tonight, this New Englander, Vermonter, Calvin Coolidge, right? The 30th president of the United States. Coolidge was president from August 1923 to March 1929, 66 or 67 months. And if you want to know one thing about Coolidge, and I discovered this in researching him, after he left office, when he went out and went back to Northampton, Massachusetts on the train, the federal budget was lower than when he came in. And I know you're sophisticated people, so is that real, Amity, or is that nominal? Well, it's real or it's nominal, because they didn't have inflation. You can pick either one. What else did they have? They had, it was lower in every way you looked at it. You could put vanilla sprinkles on top if you wanted. It was a lower budget, 28, early 29, then 23 when Coolidge came in. And what else did they have? Pretty low unemployment, balanced budget, cut the debt a lot, this debt from World War I. General good mood, strong growth. I work for the 4% growth department. Coolidge had that. Real. So it seems worthwhile to investigate this saying no, sort of suspend all the policy implications. Just look, who was this guy? What were they doing? How did it happen? Who was this Scrooge, because that's what Coolidge was, a Scrooge, who begat plenty in the rest of the economy? And how did they say no, these people? Because of course it isn't just Coolidge. And there's some valuable answers for us in there involving economic philosophy, that's the second part, statecraft, language, practical tools, and process. Coolidge, and in fact the president before him, Harding, thought a lot about the process of saying no, but just as important as all these sort of technical things or these conceptual things is something more ephemeral, which is, I'm going to say, presidential temperament. You'll see that especially when I compare Coolidge's results to Harding's results. So today I'm not just going to give you facts, I'm going to try to give you a little bit about the man, because who we are helps us do what we do. And I'll stop here and say this is a very good story, this story of saying no in the 1920s, but it's a little bit of a long one. This is a real university lecture, so I'm grateful to SMU. Professor Engel, who I'm just getting to know, a very distinguished scholar, for having me here today. This scintillating new program that he has, to my employer, the George W. Bush Center Institute. Ambassador Mark Langdale, who's here, where are you? Who's here, who brought me here, Sally McDonough, Alan Lowe, my new friends, for making this possible. I'm also grateful to a crowd like you who likes presidents and is interested in them. For some reason, Americans learn through their presidents. And when you learn through presidents, you share what you know, and some of that isn't just about what pet cat or dog they had, right? It's also all about political economy. So you, in turn, enrich the country by participating in this discussion, and I want to thank you. The Coolidge story, it starts with a mixed economy, kind of like our own in some ways. After a crisis, there was a crisis. So the crisis is World War I. There was some good news from the stock market, a lot of business money parked away in unfruitful places, not creating jobs, more unemployed than they thought they should have after World War I. Business was quite concerned about what government might do. You want to remember, in World War I, the government was a bit wild. One thing the federal government did in World War I was supervise the shutting down of the stock market. New York State did that, but the federal government was in the background. In World War I, they also nationalized the railroad, which was an important industry at that time, and then they denationalized it kind of messily. So there was a concern that the government could do just about anything, and that it was quite unpredictable, and the debt had skyrocketed. They talked about billions, we talk about trillions, but it was sort of the same experience of disbelief. So let's just say, drop the consonant, it was an illions sense of disillusionment. We don't, wait a minute, how many illions? And you can just change your consonants and you know how they felt. All of a sudden you have 26 billion or 28 illion instead of one. The federal government, that was quite a change. Taxes were way up in the 70% range. That's too high, right? And of course, there was inflation and the government wasn't acknowledging it. That's similar to now, too. What else is similar to the current situation? Pressure for entitlements. I mentioned they're unemployed after the war, a lot of them, sometimes 15% in some moments. The vets had come back from the war. There was universal conscription in World War I, so there were a lot of veterans. They didn't have Vicodin then. They didn't have antibiotics. So if you had a festering leg, you had a bad leg. It might never heal. 1/3 of those veterans was disabled at a time when women didn't work. They're a little angry. They want an entitlement. Basically, they want something like Social Security. They call it a bonus, but that's what it was, a payment that comes later for your old age. That seemed an important demand, hard to turn down. There was another interest group that wanted something, basically an entitlement. That was farmers. They wanted permanent subsidy or support from the federal government. Their case was strong too. There was trouble on the farms. Prices were down when Coolidge and Harding came in. And yet another thing that was similar 20s and now was the machine of government seemed broken. People didn't really trust the government. The president was having a hard time saying no technically, because imagine you have 3 or 4 children and they all have these cars they want, right? This was how they budgeted. So the departments would come to the president like children and say, I need this car. Here are the 7 reasons why. And the wise parent would accede and give in and buy the car. That is, sign that appropriation for that department. And then another child would come with his case for a car. And the president would sign that too. And the poor parent, the president never had an overview of his budget. He really had no budget, and he had no one to help him count it up, because there wasn't an Office of Management and Budget, and that made it hard technically for the executive to say no. The natural thing for any politician confronting this scene, including some riots here and there in 1920, would be to campaign on yes, and hope like crazy that the growth of the economy would expand and take care of all the trouble, and nothing ever changes. But what's interesting, the first part of this story is the Republican Party in this case. It could have been either party, but the Republican Party happened to campaign in 1920 on no. We promise we'll say no. One of the candidates was Warren Harding, a jovial guy. I hope I can get his picture. Whoop. There he is, right? Jovial senator, good at getting things through the Senate, from Ohio, a newspaper man. He thought he might be good to get a new budget law through Congress so he could say no. And the other was Calvin Coolidge, this sour governor from Massachusetts. He was so sour, people wondered how he got on the ticket at all. Especially other kinds of Republicans who were more active, like the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. She said that Coolidge looked like he'd been weaned on a pickle. Kind of hiding his teeth, needs some dental work. You're wondering what's in there, right? And he was different from Harding too, in that he was from Vermont. His father had collected the snow tax, the road tax, the school tax, very small beans, very modest place, not a lot of money. Did not like spending and had been raised not to like it. So these two candidates, they said, no, we won't spend. We believe taxes should be lower. Maybe you remember from school, I had a school teacher call in today when I was on public radio about this, that these two people campaigned, their logo was normalcy. And normalcy, that doesn't sound very good. We're all smart here, we're at a university, right? Normalcy is for idiots, right? Normal people want to be normal, they're not cool, right? That's sort of what we learned when we studied this period, that they had a dumbhead logo for their 1920 campaign. But when I went back and looked at it, I learned that what they meant by normalcy, that was Harding's special word, was normal environment so that we can have fun and start companies, which is different. Predictable environment. And Coolidge, who was a stickler for language, didn't like that phrase, normalcy particularly, but he liked the concept, and he called it something we would recognize more easily. He said, I'm for less uncertainty in the market. Oh. All of us talk about that now. I want to read to you from Harding's inaugural address, just because all kinds of candidates now, whether they're Democrat or Republican, tend to talk about action when they're inaugurated, right? And this is just so different. This is what they won on, and this was their idea. No altered system will work a miracle. Any wild experiment will only add to confusion. Our best assurance lies in efficient administration of our proven system. It's different from our culture today. Stay the same, don't change at all, right? And Coolidge just said, less uncertainty, reduce uncertainty again. So this ticket of no that won, they set a goal, get the budget down, and Harding picked a strong budget-cutting Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, and he and Mellon cut the tax rate from the 70s to the 50s, and he vetoed some new spending, Harding, even veteran bonuses. He changed the tools of government by passing, supervising, and then signing a budget law, the famous Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. This gave the president a tool for saying no. There were some aspects to this law that we still value today. It created essentially the modern Office of Management and Budget. He had research staff to help him say no. It also gave the president authority he has less now, which is the ability to impound money if a department seemed like it had enough. Even if, oh my gosh, well, I gave you 2 battleships or 2 pencils, but I see you're only using 1.5. I'll take that stub back now. That was a new thing. Harding took some other steps that intrigue us. He was trying to raise some money for the government. The government had lots of wealth, a mess left over from the war, surplus, oil reserves. Well, that ought to be privatized. That would bring revenue, pay down the debt, right? And with those veterans, he struck a compromise. I'm not going to give you a permanent entitlement. We can't afford the illions, but I will do something big. I will basically create something like the modern VA. I will build you hospitals and spend a lot of money on that. But you want to remember what I said. Some of this is about science, thought, and concept, and some of it is about soul and temperament. Harding was a complicated guy. So his party said no, his platform said no, his promise and speeches said no, but his heart said yes, yes, yes. He was a very big guy, a very lovable and loving guy, and the same skill that enabled him to get laws through, that of getting along with his Senate brethren, also got him in trouble. He didn't want to say no to his friends from Ohio, from the Senate. He didn't like to veto. It made him uncomfortable. He got tired of tax cutting. He'd done it. He told his advisors that he got tired of budget cutting. Well, he had got it down to 58 from 73 or something like that. The tax rate wasn't that enough. And because he wanted to say yes all the time, and this is the hard part of work, he sometimes executed poorly. He exposed himself to criticism that he was a hypocrite. For example, the privatizing of oil, that was a good idea. Revenue, reduce debt, rationalize. But the way that he did it, he sold concessions basically, or his men sold concessions basically to campaign friends. Well, then instead of worthy privatization, the project became Teapot Dome, the scandal of the Harding presidency. He did it wrong, right? Or the Veterans Bureau, there's a lot about this that I found in the archives, and it's heartbreaking. The Veterans Bureau was headed by a friend of Harding's who turned out to be corrupt. Harding really wanted to not have entitlements. That's why he made the hospitals. But the hospitals that Mr. Forbes, that was his name, built, were so poor, executed so in such a disappointing fashion. The veterans were heartbroken and angry, and that put Mr. Forbes in Leavenworth. I mean, he went to jail, and it strengthened the veterans' case, a legitimate case now, for direct payments entitlement, because if the government can't manage what it's doing, well, then you should just get a check, right? So we would say, Alice Longworth said of Harding, she damned him as a slob, okay? I think we would say now in modern political language, he squandered his political capital through his slobbery, and poor guy. And you can see this even in his personal lifestyle. Prohibition was the law at that time. You want to enforce the rule of law if you're going to enforce in other areas as a manager. The White House was the opposite of a prohibition place, though. People wrote in the papers that you went to the White House for food and action. So that undermined a little bit his authority. One of the lovable things about Harding was he knew this about himself. He could talk about it beautifully, and he did. He was frustrated with all his friends who betrayed him, and he said, I can take care of my enemies in a fight. He was a pretty good athlete, a pretty good golfer. but it's my friends, my GD friends, who keep me walking the floor at night. There's an off-color joke that someone told, which I will also tell because it relates directly to policy. It was told by his father and repeated by Warren. Dr. Harding said that it was a good thing President Harding wasn't a girl, because if he was, he'd always be in the family way. So Harding died, I think, of this inconsistency, and I'm sure Dr. Engel will have the Harding revisionist here shortly to edit this and add some things. But right now, I'll say Harding died of his inconsistency, tragically, August 23. And right away, people, August 1923, a lot of you work on political campaigns. You're calculating, how many months to the election? Not so many, just a little over a year, right? So that vice president who comes in, he's a lame duck. Right? Well, he might be nothing. Quiet guy, Coolidge, Vermonter. He was sworn in by kerosene light. Kept his, not politically very attractive. You remember the Alice Longworth quote. The portrait painters, Clarence Barron, who owned the Wall Street Journal, which followed him closely, said he gave the portrait painters a lot of trouble because he intentionally kept his face expressionless. Cool. He was a withholder. So they called him vice president, becomes president, close to new election, the accident of an accident when he came in. They didn't expect much from him. But right away, those in the entourage in Washington, Coolidge comes down from Vermont, like Theodore Roosevelt before him, to take this job, something different. And I was reading the letters of Charles Evans Hughes, a beautiful writer, Secretary of State, goes over to the White House to see the new president, and right away he does notice something different. Harding was never alone. There were always good advisors there, and they settled something by consensus. In the room, he goes to the White House, goes into the office. Coolidge is all by himself with nothing but his cigar, maybe some newspapers. And Hughes noticed that when you left the Harding office, one of the good things about Harding was he always got something. The president always gave you something. It was very small before you left. You could assume when you left the Coolidge White House that you were leaving with nothing. And when Coolidge, this man, started to speak, he didn't say, I'll just go along with the past. He said, stiff things, kind of judgmental, disconcerting things. I am for economy, and after that, I am for more economy. He even used shame. We must have no carelessness in our dealing with public property or the expenditure of public money. Such a condition is characteristic of undeveloped people. Daunting, right? And then he proceeded to continue the policy job that Harding had started and do more of it, sort of take it to the end. Taxes, well, 50%, that's nowhere near low enough. The taxes have to go way down. Tax campaign has just begun. Saving, I'm going to put all my energy into saving. We're going to go way, way down. He went over to Mellon's office. Mellon was also silent, so you imagine two silent guys waging a political campaign. And the great magnates, sort of Warren Buffett, combination of Warren Buffett and Sarah Gabriel, and the Treasury Secretary and Coolidge, they planned this tax campaign without talking. It was said they conversed in pauses. Treasury Secretary, this was their war, though. They were doing it. Mellon had this idea, we're gonna flatten that schedule. He thought maybe he'd get rid of the special tax status of municipal bonds. That's a revolutionary idea, right? Well, if he couldn't do that, he was gonna cut the rate way down. He was going to get it down to 25. And Mellon had this theory from business. He was so incredibly successful in business. That theory was, he'd seen from railroading that maybe if you cut the rate, that is the freight for a railroad, then you got more traffic. You charge, as Mellon put it, what the traffic will bear to get the optimal revenue for your company. And he thought that might apply to taxes. Coolidge wasn't so sure. Coolidge, very cautious guy. And this Mellon, who never taught, Coolidge pushed him until he wrote a book. And in those days, Treasury secretaries did not write books. The Case for the Tax Cut. Taxation, the people's business. Hopefully this will be in the Bush Library. It goes for $1,200 on ABE Books right now. because it was a serious book, Treasury Secretary Case for My Tax Cut. And I think there's sort of a legend that this tax cut of Coolidge and Mellon, you know Coolidge is famous for persistence, right? Went through easily. I'm here to report it did not. The charts you look at are misleading. The tax cut that came in 1925 was not passed in 1925, but only in 1926. It was retroactive. The first tax cut they got was kind of an awful compromise with the progressives and the Democrats, and it had a very creepy provision that the Wall Street Journal saw and told Coolidge, you better veto this. The provision of the first tax law was that all rich people's tax returns should be put on the wall at the post office. Did you sign that? What do you think Henry Ford would think of that, right? He did sign it, and the Wall Street Journal said that the progressives were hazing the president because it had some rate cuts, and he thought, well, if I win again, I can get rid of that nasty provision, maybe get down to my 25% rate. They went along, he did win, and they did get their tax cut again later in 26, and that was the 25% rate that inspired Reagan, that inspired Kennedy, that inspired President Bush 43, all along. It was passed in 26, retroactive. You always gave the voter more than the voter expected. I like that about him. How else did Coolidge say no? Well, certainly legislatively. Harding had vetoed 6 laws. Coolidge vetoed 50. He vetoed, more vet benefits, new entitlements, postal payments, special gifts, of course, of farming, right? He was kind of a scholar of device, and again, temperament matters. Each president finds his device, and Coolidge liked the pocket veto. Why? Because you don't have to write a message with it. Silent Cal also. It can't be overridden, the pocket veto, but there's an art to it. The Congress has to pass the bill kind of late in the session, and then wham, you kill it in the recess, right? You're like, I don't know, a snake or a tiger. And he became like a veritable Isaac Stern of the tricky pocket veto. And this killing a bill, he enjoyed that, not because of arrogance, but because he thought he was protecting the people. He had written when he was a young man to his father, who happened to be a lawmaker in Montpelier, Vermont, it is more important to kill bad bills than to pass good ones. A refrainer, right? He also showed an ability, rare, to cut in areas that were dear to him. Farming was suffering. He kind of was a farmer. His family were in farming. His father had a cheese factory. What is a cheese factory? It's an act of desperation if you don't have refrigeration or trains that come to your town, because the milk is preserved as cheese and can go to Boston and be sold, right? Imagine a little cheese cooperative in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. That was their effort at surviving in terms of agriculture, where he came from. And yet, when the farmers came to him, not because he didn't sympathize with them, but because he was wrong, he vetoed their legislation. And there's on record, what he said one time to a farming official. Should we help the farmers subsidize the farms? Well, farmers never have made much money. That's what Coolidge said. Don't suppose they ever will. Not much we can do about it. Very different attitude. How else did he fight big government? What I discovered was it wasn't just a social quirk, not a New England oddity. He wasn't just a throwback you could tell stories about, right? It was a political method. You notice if you don't talk, people wind down. All presidents notice this. They leave sooner. You're not just being mean, you have the ability to say no more quickly. You're less susceptible to saying yes if you don't talk. The journalists, needless to say, look at President Obama now, like access. So they didn't always get this, that Coolidge was so silent. They thought he was mean and lazy. Except for one clever journalist, Walter Lippmann. I want to read to you what he said about President Coolidge. It wasn't totally friendly, but it captures him. The White House, the Coolidge White House, is extremely sensitive to the first symptom of any desire on the part of Congress or executive departments to do something. The skill with which Mr. Coolidge applies his wet blanket is technically marvelous. There has never been Mr. Coolidge's equal in the art of deflating interest. The naive statesman may imagine it is desirable to interest people in their government, that indignation at evil is useful, but Mr. Coolidge is more sophisticated. He has discovered the value of diverting attention from the government, and with an exquisite subtlety that amounts to genius, he has used dullness and boredom as political device. One of the things we've been looking at for the Coolidge bio is his calendar, what he did every day, which we scanned at the Library of Congress. Coolidge had many meetings. Part of this is preparation and discipline. Many meetings with his budget director, General Lord. They met Friday mornings before the cabinet meeting, so they were prepared to say no in the cabinet meeting. And we quantified these meetings with the budget meisters because most presidents slack off. I'm sure they're experts in second terms here. You can see Eisenhower slacking off in the budget department. It gets tiring, right? After a while, and I looked at how often Coolidge met with his budget man, and in 1923, it was a short year, 14 times, 1924, 55 times, 1925, 52 times, 1926, 63 times. He didn't give up. The guy just kept going. When it came to using that budget law, Coolidge was particularly aggressive. They would have a meeting twice a year in a room like this. That would be Memorial Continental Hall, you know where the DAR is in Washington. And they would haul all the cabinet departments in there, the members of the cabinet, the noble members, and this was not an optional meeting with the president and his budget man. And these two leaders, the president and his budget man, would stand there and berate their executives. You haven't cut your budget, you've got to cut it more, with a kind of theater that we were not used to. Both of these guys were both from New England. General Lord was from Maine, so they liked, sort of woodsy metaphors. They treated these cabinet members like kindergartners. First, they created a 2% club, and you had to cut your budget 2%, and you got a prize. Like what, a sticker? Then, after a while, they couldn't cut 2%. Remember, the economy's growing, the population's growing. If you cut your budget 1%, you get a prize. And then after that, people couldn't cut their budget 1% anymore. They were getting tired. So they said, they created the Woodpecker Club for people who pecked away at their budget here and there and managed to cut it a little bit. I told you they were New Englanders. They were teaching their departments to be accountable and to say no. Coolidge also, we discovered, demonstrated his thrift in his personal household. And there's a little sorrowful story in there about budgeting. He had a housekeeper named Mrs. Jaffray. She'd been there at the White House since the Tafts, and she rode around with a horse and a buggy, and she liked the specialty shops. This was the White House, right? And Coolidge, this bothered Coolidge. He thought she should go to the supermarket. He thought she should go to the Piggly Wiggly. Economy of scale, right? And you do hear about presidents cutting pork, right? It's kind of we forget what pork is. It's a figurative metaphor. Pork was literally the issue that divided and separated the president and his housekeeper. One day she had a big spread, dinner for diplomats, very important thing out there, what we're going to eat. And Coolidge, she invited the president to inspect it, seeking his approval, and all he could say when he looked it over was that it looked like an awful lot of ham to him. And very soon after that, Mrs. Jaffray left, and a nice lady from New England came who budgeted every penny, and we've digitized her budget, and it's available to you. So that was Miss Riley. And I want to tell you, I'm glad that in 1926, the White House spent $11,667.10 on feeding its guests. And Miss Riley, the new austerity housekeeper, managed to get that down to $9,116.39, a total saving of about $2,500. And she handed this in, and Mr. President wrote on it, "To Miss Riley," in pencil. "Very fine improvement." he also advertised his mania for budgeting. A South African mayor, to the people, a South African mayor gave the president twin lion cubs. People are always giving the president things, you know. So these and the White House got to name them, and they didn't name them Pussy and, you know, Sissy. You know what they named the lion cubs? Budget Bureau and Tax Reduction. And you notice that they're twin lions. It's not like tax reduction is a big manly lion and Budget Bureau is a little bitty runt lion, right? Runty cub. No, they had to be even. That was the Coolidge view. You can't cut taxes. He wasn't a modern supply-sider, right? And usually, and a lot of people here have worked with presidents, you know how valuable president's time is, right? Everyone wants to get in there, as per Harding, I mentioned. The Coolidges had breakfasts at the White House, like any president. You think everyone would want to go, anyone would go to any president when they invited him, but for some reason, after a while, the lawmakers just didn't show up anymore at the White House when they got invited. What a mystery. And the usher at the White House, his name was Ike Hoover, who didn't get very good tips from the Coolidges, was kind of mean, and he kept a diary of the excuses the lawmakers made rather than come at the president's invitation. And I will read them to you. They're a little mean. Okay, you ready? Senator Heflin, breakfast, no, regrets, sick. Senator Norris, unable to locate. Senator Pittman, regrets, sick. Senator Reed of Missouri, regrets, sick friend. Rarely has a chief executive been so spurned by fellow lawmakers. And there is one moment when Coolidge sort of gives a confessional about this. He had a conference call with philanthropy group, actually Jewish philanthropists in New York. They did have conference calls then. And I want to read to you what he said about his embarrassing budget obsession, his Scrooge reputation. To be confidential for a moment, I may confess that an invitation to make a speech is not the rarest experience for a president. But I listened to your invite with, I hope, perhaps proper politeness, down to the point where your spokesman started explaining you were going to devote your evening to the budget. And then I began to take a real interest, for the budget idea, I may admit, is a sort of obsession with me. I believe in budgets. I want other people to believe in them. I've had a small one for my family, and I am the head of the organization that makes the greatest of all budgets, that of the U.S. Do you wonder, then, that at times I dream of balance sheets and sinking funds, of deficits and tax rates and all the rest? Yes, I regard a good budget as among the noblest monuments of virtue. It is deserving of all emulation. What a story. There was kind of almost a test of almost biblical proportion in his life in this regard, and it had to do with, of all things, disaster relief, a topic we have to think about today too, and floods and things like that. There was this terrible flood in the South, the flood of the Mississippi. John Barry, I hope he comes here, wrote a beautiful book about it. So many, many states were covered with water. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. And the question was, 1927, would the president go down? And at the same time, there was very expensive legislation about disasters and Washington fixing them before Congress, and Coolidge felt that it was wrong for the executive to go down, and that if he went down, that legislation, which he opposed, would succeed, that he wouldn't be able to block it. And he didn't. He sent Herbert Hoover, his commerce secretary, down, the flood czar, and he sent the Red Cross, which did organize much, but he did not go. And as now, Katrina, our own experience recently, not everyone understood a president who doesn't go down. And one senator, Thaddeus Caraway, goaded Coolidge about this and lay out a kind of challenge. He said, and Coolidge wouldn't call a special session either. People spend money in special sessions. I venture to say that if a similar disaster had affected New England, where the president's from, that the president would have had no hesitation in calling an extra session. Unfortunately, he was unable to visualize the situation, Caraway said. And then, so just unreal, there was a flood in New England, the Vermont flood of the autumn of 1927. And you may know it's a terrible flood. There are books about that too. And of course, we have evidence that Coolidge monitored it closely. His own road down the road was washed away. In that flood in Vermont, the lieutenant governor drowned trying to get to his car. That's how violent and sudden it was. Should not the president go to his home space? But Coolidge did not go, and that was a very bitter moment for Vermont. It was hard on him, it was hard on Washington, but it was not necessarily hard on the country. First, it wasn't unpopular. Coolidge, of course, did have to run in 1924, right? And people thought he might lose. The Progressive Party was very strong. The Progressive Party at that time wanted to nationalize the railroad and power. So it was an aggressive, left-wing Progressive Party. It got 17% of the vote, like Ross Perot, and the Democrats got votes, but Coolidge actually claimed more votes than the two groups combined. He had an absolute majority in 1924 for his policy of saying no. And then comes 1928. Before me, Professor Brands from UT was here, right? Talked about second terms. Do you run for a second term? Coolidge, everyone wanted him to run for a second term. He thought he shouldn't. We could talk about that later. As he wrote in his autobiography, he thought that, like Lord Acton, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So he didn't, but the Republican Party wasn't happy when he chose not to run. They practically had a nervous breakdown because they knew he would win. And when Hoover did run, he ran on Coolidge policy explicitly. Coolidge policy was more popular than Hoover himself. You could spend a whole talk talking about what's behind this, a different economic philosophy, a philosophy that austerity can beget growth, but also a natural humility, a deep religious faith, so deep it bothered some other politicians. Hoover called Coolidge fundamentalist. A great faith. The Coolidges were, especially after the death of their son, very church-focused. And when Charles Lindbergh, superstar, it's like having Taylor Swift come stay with you, right? Superstar, like having, I don't know who, come to stay with you. They didn't, it came to stay with them. They were nice to him and they gave him a big parade and all that, but when they took him to church, they didn't like the suit he had on and they made him change. It wasn't respectful enough for church. The Coolidges were very church-oriented, very serious. Their faith, so Coolidge specifically felt that he didn't want to play God, that he would rather preside as president than be the dictator, be the deity. He had many sour moments as president, and especially after his son died. And there was a senator called Zeldin Spencer who took him walking, tried to cheer him up, and pointing to the White House, "Who lives in that pretty house with all the pillars?" What did Coolidge say? Nobody. They just come and go. Sense of service sounds negative, but it's also a sense of service. That's what motivated him. He cared about legacy, and he did clean up the White House. I could argue and would that it was good for the economy. We can talk about that in the discussion time. I know that one of the first questions you're going to ask is, did he cause the Great Depression? And Coolidge-like, I'm going to tell you now, I'm ready to answer, but you could say one word, no. And to the question of whether there could ever be another Coolidge now when we're all so soft, and so I think certainly we could, especially when we're confronted more directly, which will happen with the consequences of our entitlement obligations. Yes, in a talk about no, I'll close by saying, is another Coolidge possible? Yes. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions, so if you wouldn't mind, raise your hand if you have one, and actually I'll let you just call whoever you like.
Hey, no, you call
Okay. Sir, please.
Could you expand on your last comment? Because the Great Depression did happen only 7 months after he left office, so how did Hoover have screwed it up that bad in that short period of time?
That's a very important question. Okay, so when Coolidge announced stock market went too high, let's just start with that. Stock market went too high, it tripled. So we know if the stock market would triple today, I guess it quadrupled, right? It went to 381 eventually in the end of summer 1929. Nobody liked that. Coolidge didn't like that. But the stock market had many, many times gone high before and gone down by 30 or 40%, and no Great Depression of 11 years followed. There was no crash like that. So the first thing, I actually wrote my preceding book about this. When I look at the Great Depression, I see many, many causes, and some of them might be attributed to Coolidge. Certainly support for the tariff. The GOP was for the tariff, and one of the things that exacerbated the downturn was the passage of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, which Hoover, not Coolidge, signed. But in Forgotten Man, the book where I address this, I basically argue that Hoover was a different kind of president, much more active. Coolidge didn't like Hoover. He called him Wonder Boy. And did 4 or 5 things that Coolidge would have hesitated to do, starting with insist that wages rise on the theory, kind of modern, that if you give workers more money, they'll spend more and get the economy going, stimulus. But that, of course, as every employer knows, puts you in a quandary. If you're going to agree with what the government says and raise your wages, you're going to have to lay some people off if you're having trouble with your company, or you're going to rehire more slowly. So that was a new policy of Hoover's, plus Smoot-Hawley, plus, of course, a ferocious tax rise, which Coolidge rued publicly in his columns, plus. But Coolidge clearly knew, you can see from his stock portfolio, that there was going to be a crash. He didn't like it. He was sorry about it. He held back, but remember, at that time, the federal government didn't even regulate this. It was New York State that regulated New York Stock Exchange, right? So his argument, and I think mine too, would be you have to balance between whether you set a precedent of the government taking over when you get to a negative part of the business cycle, or you don't set that precedent. And in his estimation, it was better not to intervene, for the market to learn from its own consequences, the stock market, and then the country could right itself. That's not what happened. But as I argue lengthily, it was more, you can make the case the interventions made it worse rather than the circumstances of the 20s.
Sir. Leighton McCartney, in his book about the Teapot Dome.
Oh, that's a good book. I like that book.
What?
I like that book.
Yeah. Would you comment? He contends that oil oligarchs, who are actually very close to Dallas and Oklahoma, actually chose Harding, ran him for president, got him elected. Would you comment about whether Coolidge was involved with that, and then whether they had an influence as oligarchs on Coolidge after Harding died?
I don't know any evidence that they had influence on Coolidge. Do you think they did?
I don't know. They were very rich. I mean,
they were very rich.
They were throwing around $10 million back then. $10 million.
You know, I've never studied that. The thing about Harding really was that he liked his donors. He liked his friends, and he didn't know they would use him. It was a little bit of naivety, I think. That book seemed very good to me. It shows how people schemed around Harding to get jobs they probably shouldn't have had, especially Forbes, the hospital man, but also Fall and Doherty. And this put Coolidge in such a position because on the one hand, he'd been taught that you sustain continuity when you come in after a president died. He studied very closely what Theodore Roosevelt did after Roosevelt's president, McKinley, right, died suddenly. And, you know, for the market's sake, well, it's the government's job to keep things calm, right? So he kept on a lot of the Harding people, even though he didn't really feel comfortable with them. And you can see that in his correspondence. But eventually, he established sort of Watergate-like a commission, and some of them left. No, I don't see evidence, but maybe you know it, that Coolidge was ruled by oil oligarchs. We have a web page where, do you have some evidence?
Was Coolidge involved in according to the McCartney book, these guys found Harding, nominated him got him the nomination for president and got him elected. And I just wondered, was Coolidge knowledgeable?
Oh, not at all. I mean, Coolidge didn't even go to the convention. His state was badly split, and those snobby Boston people, Henry Cabot Lodge didn't think Coolidge should get the nomination. No, so he didn't go. He kind of pouted at the State House in Massachusetts, in Boston. He had reasons to think he might deserve a nomination. That's another speech, but he didn't go. He took the news by telephone, vice president. He wrote his father an apology. I hope you'll be happy with the vice presidential spot. And he campaigned meeting with Harding not too many times. And I noticed when Harding died, the Coolidges hadn't seen him for months. After Congress went in recess, Harding went off, he was ill, and the Coolidges went home in the spring, and Harding only died early in August. So there was a big separation. Coolidge did attend cabinet meetings, but we don't have any evidence this showed up in the cabinet meetings. So, no, as far as I know, no, thank you.
Let's go to the back, please.
Hi there. I'm a United States history teacher at the 11th grade level, and I just want to say I find it very interesting how the national perception is that inactivity is essentially, the idea of being callous and careless, and of course, FDR proving the strong contrast. I just find that really interesting. I was so intrigued by the perspective that you provided in The Forgotten Man. And if you could really quickly, I'm asking you to do two things. One is, can you quickly compare how the United States exited the recession of 1920-21? Because you set the table so nicely in trying to explain what happened in 1929, that Hoover was overly active. If you could do that, and then also, in the last, I believe it was the third presidential debates, President Obama accused Mitt Romney of running an economic style reminiscent of the 1920s. Had you been Mitt Romney, how would you have answered that? I've got a lot of mileage out there.
Oh, thank you, and thank you for teaching history. I talk to history teachers all the time, and we appreciate that very much. Obama 1920s, the 20s were great. Here's the case, right? They were, actually. The productivity gains were phenomenal. The number of patents, if you look at that data, was attractive. And many of the things that were patented in the 20s later became quite profitable and interesting. Basically the early ideas for television, for example, the talking visual radio. So there's a lot to like about the 20s. It's not just all prohibition and champagne bubbles. The data are there, quite solid. The statistics of income, the tax cuts made the rich pay more taxes. SOI. Look on the St. Louis Fed website. I mean, it's all there for your students. So President Obama learned what most Americans learned, but that's probably somewhat wrong, that the 20s were wrong and bad. They weren't. Second question, also interesting from an educational point of view, what happened in another recession? It's kind of hilariously different from now. So what do you do when you have incredible inflation expectation because of an arrogant Treasury Secretary, that was McAdoo, who was married, let's see, to the president's daughter? Do you know the Treasury Secretary in World War I was married to the president's daughter? Do you imagine the kind of authority that gave the guy? Also, he's very smart. So there was a lot of inflation expectation in the economy because he decided how many bonds he was going to buy or sell, right? Liberty bonds. Oh, I went in my head and I decided it should be $3 billion. He actually writes that in his memoir. So you have a sense, as other times, that there was incredible arbitrariness in monetary policy, is what I'm saying, in credit policy, and therefore there was large inflation and inflation expectation after the war. People were out of work. I started to sketch it right after the war. The federal government spent 18 times what it had spent before. So what was the recipe? And to be fair, this is not the Coolidge recipe. It's the end of the Wilson administration getting over its own binge and the beginnings of the Republicans. What was the recipe? You do unemployment, inflation you're lying about, unhappy people. What do? Let's see, you cut the federal government in half and you raise interest rates 300 basis points, effectively doubling them. That's how you handle a recession. I mean, trouble. You force a recession on the country, they did in the early 20s. It was a terrible recession. They called it a depression. There was 17% unemployment. Harry Truman lost his haberdasher shop. Why don't we talk about it? Because we don't remember it. because it was too short. What we say in econ, prices found their level. The inflation expectation was wrung out of the system. People saw the government was going to be smaller and the US would not tolerate inflation, and things got back to normal. So when you teach your students, if they're ready for that, that model exists. I've lectured on it, like to banks. You can just walk through it with 4 PowerPoints. It's very powerful. It's a different recipe, profoundly different from what we would use. And that wasn't even Coolidge. That was slightly before him, but it was infused with a spirit that he also shared.
Speaking of Secretary of the Treasury, during the 1920s, we had 3 presidents who were Republicans. Harding, Coolidge, we had 1 Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, who was a multi-billionaire. And he was responsible for those tax reductions, major tax reductions, which led to uncontrolled investment, things like the Florida land boom, which collapsed, and should have been a warning to the government to do something, and massive investment by really a relative handful of investors in the stock market in the 1920s. It caused the stock market to go sky high, which of course collapsed because there wasn't anything. There was a mountain of credit with mobile, mountain of money with mobile credit. And so, what's the role here of the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, and his influence on Mr. Coolidge, Mr. Harding, Mr. Hoover, as opposed to, address that issue?
Oh, sure. I'm not sure I would sketch it quite so bleak as you say it, but it could be bleak. Land booms happen all the time, and you have to ask yourself whether they're the government's responsibility. I mean, some of that is, you have a monetary argument. There's a land boom and the stock market went up. But if it were truly a real inflation, you would have seen it in other prices. And it wasn't there in the other prices. The prices of things in the 1920s went down, the basket of goods that a housewife would buy. So it's an interesting period, sort of like the 90s. How inflationary were the 90s? It wasn't like overall inflation.
Inflation wasn't the issue. It was investment.
Okay, so from an Austrian, you can argue that too. This is what was going on with Mellon. Mellon had an eye to Europe, and you can see that explicitly in the Canadian biography of Mellon. He had the following thought in mind. Europe was in trouble. It might have some future unrest. That was a good guess, right? After World War I, before World War II. Future unrest might happen. The only way to reduce the possibility of future disruption in Europe of the incredible scale that had been World War I is to help them with their debts. Well, you don't want to just let them, not pay them at all, default, right? That's not good. That's bad for credit markets. It's bad for them because they're going to need to borrow money again. And you don't want to totally forgive, so you just want to make things easier. And if you want to ascribe some responsibility to Mellon, because a lot of this was at the Fed, Benjamin Strong, for example, and there are whole books about this, like by Lester Chandler. Mellon supported it because he thought it was better for Europe to get easier terms and pay its debts than for it not to pay at all, for all of us, for those governments to get past the war. And you can see this quite clearly in the correspondence of Mellon and the Treasury. Coolidge was at a remove because he was a great delegator, both to Mellon and Kellogg at State. He really believed as an executive in delegation, and he supported Mellon in all Mellon did, even if Mellon was wrong on the principle of delegation, another kind of presidency, but there's merit in the delegation principle. What happened particularly, in 27 they eased. In 28, I was just trying to look this up this afternoon, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they tightened. They went back up after the storied protest of the Chicago Fed. They raised rates in anticipation of money being too easy. Apparently they didn't raise rates enough. In the middle of it, Benjamin Strong died, the important central banker of the US in New York. I don't assign I assign blame for the crash maybe to Treasury and to monetary policy. I believe monetary policy was part of it, but it's not necessarily an international Great Depression 10 years after. And when you look at the specific steps, there's always a pretty good explanation for what they were trying to do, that tightening in 28. Then there's some loosening at the end of 28, then tightening again. Clearly they didn't tighten enough. It's a complicated story. Thank you for the question.
Sir, please.
Yes, I notice you have a number of slides here that are behind this one. Somebody flipped through them. I wonder if I assume that from your book. Could you,
Oh, I think I got
through
them.
those and tell us?
Oh, sorry, that's Harding. I'm sorry, that's Harding. That's Coolidge. That's Harding, right? Does he look like he says yes? That's why he's there. There's no big drama here. That's Coolidge. He looks like he says no.
How did Coolidge,
That's my
how was he seen after the administration was over, and what part did he play in Hoover's administration when he died?
Well, one of the tragedies of life is that you're not always appreciated in your retirement, right? We all know people who do great things, and it just happened. The period of their retirement was not the period of appreciation for their work. We all have parents like that, right? Nobody will ever understand what you did in 1975. Dad was great until much later, and you'll be dead by then. No one in your church or right? That's what happened to Coolidge. It was, of course, bitter. It was a progressive era. He had kept his finger in this dike, holding back the progressive impulse, the waters of progressivism. He didn't like progressivism by the end of his career. And then when he pulled his finger out and retired, the progressive waters flowed, and all the things he had dreaded came to pass, and sanctimony. He had said, I'm not going to intervene, and lo and behold, the other people intervened. So they were wrecking his legacy, but it was also his principle not to intervene, so he was all agonized. I have a chapter called Coolidge Agonistes. You walk off, I'm right, everyone follow me. Oh, surprise, you're not following me. What? I'm doing the right thing. He was a little sanctimonious. You know what? People don't recognize it when you do the right thing. We've all had that experience, right? So this was a little bit bitter for the Coolidges, but he did find an outlet, he had an enormously successful newspaper column. He made more money than he'd ever made in his life with this newspaper column, which he wrote every morning from 8 to 10, and it was always just a few hundred words, maybe less. I have a little booklet of them, and he made it sort of an embarrassing amount of money, especially embarrassing during what was clearly becoming a bad downturn. You can see in his letters to his son how concerned he is about everyone's welfare. Oh, don't feel bad about your maybe losing your job. I'm paraphrasing, so don't hold me to it, but maybe, your job at the railroad. Everyone's worried about their job. And he had a rough retirement. The day he died, I noticed, and this is in the final pages of the book, it said in the newspaper that Roosevelt was going to have hydropower. The government was going to be in charge, go down to the dam at Muscle Shoals. And this was something Coolidge had vetoed and opposed year in, year out. So exactly what he had dreaded was coming to pass. And that was in the paper in early January 1933. And unfortunately, at a young age, Coolidge was, I guess, 60. He had a heart attack and died. And I know that, of course, his retirement wasn't as he imagined it would be. But somebody, and that somebody was the Wall Street Journal, wrote a little obit that said, right now people don't appreciate what Coolidge did, but they might later.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask it.
Oh, that lady, right? I feel like she's been waiting. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to ask if you found it to be a dichotomy for him to be so tight with budgets and saying no, but yet was a laissez-faire economist himself. I mean, is that?
Well, in his eyes, they weren't inconsistent. He just said, I'm going to be tight with budgets so you can be free. Government austerity, private freedom. And also, he made the moral case for tax cuts. I have a big article in Primus about this. He wasn't just a behaviorist, we cut taxes. Mellon was more of a behaviorist, and then the rabbit will get to the carrot faster or something. He thought tax cuts were good because too much taxes were wrong. So he didn't see an inconsistency. But yeah, to be a liberal that is free when you're an accountant is hard temperamentally. Okay.
I just one thought, and I want to ask you something which is very difficult for any historian or biographer, which is to put yourself not back in the 20s and 30s, but today, in Coolidge's mind. Would he be in favor of sequestration?
Oh, totally. Because here's why. We said we would do it. So we should do what we said. Demonstration effect. So we take ourselves seriously. Setting aside whether sequestration would cause economic chaos, which it wouldn't, because it's not a very big sequester, he would do it because he was very much about building trust. You do what you say you're going to do. And then next time people will, next time those congressmen will take sequestration seriously because they know it's really coming, and so they'll make a bunch of deals before the sequester hits. If he had a little fable, it would be crying wolf. Don't cry wolf. Do what you say you're going to do. Thank you very much.
Amity, and one of the things that I think we should do is always do what we say, which is that we're going to have book sales outside, so it's already a bestseller. So give one to all your friends, because they probably already have one. And have some books. Please have some coffee and some treats, and we look forward to continuing the discussion outside. Thank you.